Hello, my friends. My name is Aaron, and I am back with another episode of History Buttons. I know it's been over a week since I last brought you an episode. I had to build a brand new computer, one that is actually capable of video editing. And, I've been working on this, on kind of a history of the Trizub, which is the Ukrainian, stylized trident on the Ukrainian seal. And I talked about its history and, its origins, and but I'm going to take a little detour because because Ukrainian history took a detour away from that for a while. I talked about how the Kievan Rus formed, their origins, where some of the symbology came from, some of the iconography, kind of the foundational myth. And then they had issues. They were not a unified empire the way that would later develop. They didn't have a concept of primogeniture, which that was something that was used quite a lot by the West to decide who gets what. In the case of primogeniture, it means the oldest son inherits everything. Instead, all these little instead, if you had, say, 15, 20 children, you might divide stuff up between a lot of them. And they had a lot of principalities as part of Kievan Rus. Novgorod was one, although it was Sviatoslav, I believe it was, made them a republic instead because of their loyalty to him. Or maybe that's Vladimir. It's been a couple weeks since I gave that presentation. And the issue was who gets to be the king. Well, they didn't have a king. They had a grand prince because they were all princes. They were all, all the children of the previous leader would then vie for power, which means that basically everybody was wasting all their time and energy and expending all their resources and lives. Pardon me. I'll be editing that out. In order to just against one another. And I mean, you would have armies, and when I say armies, we're not talking tens of thousands of people, because they didn't have tens of thousands of, they didn't have armies that size, but armies nonetheless, and they would, you had all sorts of, brothers killing one another through intrigue and all that, and that allowed the Mongols to come through in the 13th century, and they just, of course, they just steamrolled everywhere they went, and most of where they went was more central and south. Some of the areas were pretty much left untouched because the Mongols didn't roll through there. Kiev, pretty much utterly destroyed as a city. They had, in fact, the entire swath of what's now Ukraine was pretty much depopulated by the Mongols. People who came through later on after the fighting settled down would remark about the skeletons of the dead just laying in heaps still. you're walking on top of bodies on the ground, and they Kiev had at one point, it was one of the largest cities in Europe, like 50,000 residents. And after the Mongols came through, the delegate for the Pope said that it had been reduced to around 200 households, all of them slaves to the Mongols, and that was pretty much it for that area. I mean, it takes a long time to rebuild population. It takes a long time to, and what ended up happening was you had those areas that were still the rest of the rest of the Rus kind of, after seeing what happened in the southern area, ended up just kind of the princes, most of them just surrendered and said, okay, you want us to pay tribute, we'll pay tribute. And so the Mongols took over a lot of like what's European Russia, and the rest of it kind of went theoretically, Lithuania, Poland. They were initially separate, but then they came together under the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and they kind of moved in because there's nobody down there. It was pretty much, the Golden Horde kind of controlled things. They became known as the Tatars or Tartars. I've seen both of those spellings. So if you get confused between the Tatars and Tartars, you're not alone. The people writing about this have trouble. I think it's probably the same groups. But the result was that you had basically what the Lithuanians called the wild fields, which was the entire steppe area, going from like this area along the Dnipro, all the way over into Central Asia. They just called it the wild fields, and but it was a place with very little authority, right, where there really wasn't anyone in charge. There was an administration going on, and these other Europe had long adopted serfdom, which is basically the people working the land belong to the land, and whoever owns the land owns the people. And basically, you're tied to that land. You're born there and you die there, and you don't really have much. Theoretically, the ruler of the area has an obligation to keep you alive, have an obligation to make sure you can eat, make sure you have, some kind of a shelter. But that's a very minimal kind of obligation. Theoretically, also to keep you safe. And this was, it's kind of odd because of the when the Black Death swept through Europe, that kind of changed things quite a bit. Serfs, farmers were suddenly a lot more valuable. But that didn't necessarily happen in this area. And instead, you had increased serfdom. You had and people were running away, and they ran away to the vacant areas, which were the wild fields. But you still had the Tatars, you still had the Golden Horde, you still had raiders coming in from different areas, and the people banded together, and they lived in a military society, and that military society is what's called they call themselves Cossacks, or maybe other people call themselves Cossacks, and they developed a sort of autonomy, mostly because there weren't a lot of them. They were in a big area of Europe, and they were military, like trying to really take them over was, I mean, they were military. These were military groups. They were organized into hosts. And the biggest one was a group called and I'm going to butcher this because I am not Ukrainian. I do not speak anything like a Slavic language, but I'm going to go ahead and butcher it anyway. I believe it's Zaprasian. I think when I listen to things about the war on Ukraine, they talk about Zaprasian. So I'm just going to call it the Zaprasian Host. And if that's incorrect, then correct me in the comments. And the Zaprasian Host, the Zaprasian, they were kind of different than what you find in the rest of Europe. They were, and it wasn't just because they were Eastern Orthodox. Of course, you had other Eastern Orthodox. It was their militancy. It was that they were organized militarily. They had a fort that they called it a siege, S-I-C-H. I'm going to call it a siege. If that's wrong, then we'll blame whoever transliterated it into the Latin alphabet and into English, because a lot of times I think that the Cyrillic alphabet primarily exists just so that people can be marked as outsiders when they go from one land to another. But this flag here is when you go looking for the flag of this host, of this Sikh. This is one of two flags that pops up. And I find this to be a very interesting symbol. Of course, you have Christianity there, right? And you have these other symbols. And there's not a lot about this flag in particular. And you have to understand, all of this symbolism, all of the original accoutrements were taken by Russia, and they were supposed to be returned to the Ukrainians. But after the first revolution in 1917, but then there was the second revolution that brought the Bolsheviks to power, and I don't think they gave a lot of. I don't think they really cared too much for orders like that, for agreements like that to be carried out. And even the Ukrainians here in the U.S. that I've had contact with and asked about this, they haven't. This isn't really a symbol that they recognize. There were other symbols. A Cossack with a spear is a much more commonly known symbol. But this, to me, says something about who the Zaprasian Cossacks were. You have what they call the Cossack cross in the center, And I'm sure people know it by other names because a cross is a very basic kind of symbol, especially among Christians. And the same basic design can be claimed by multiple groups. But then you also have these crescents, and you have the star. You have these solar, these sky symbols, I guess. You have the two crescent moons. You have the six-pointed star. You have the sun. And one of the things that occurs to me is that, I mean, and people debated for, 100, 200 years about where the Cossacks actually came from. That people thought that the idea was that they had come from they were from the steppes. They weren't indigenous to the area, but nowadays they can go through and they can do DNA tests on remains, and there's all sorts of different ways to analyze old stuff. And heck, you can take 6,000-year-old pottery and figure out that it came from an area far away or nearby to that place, and you can use that to trace out old trade routes that long ago vanished from people's knowledge, and they've come to the, and these days it's mostly, from my understanding, it's mostly recognized that the Cossacks were mostly indigenous to that area. They were a homegrown defense group because they were constantly being raided. But you can't have a group like that out by themselves. So the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, or at least that which became that, and that will be another History Buttons episode later on. This never ends, believe me. Every time you turn around, there's like, I really don't know much about that. I should research that. And so then it's like, well, I really need to focus on the one thing that I'm working on this week, and so I don't have a good understanding of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, but I will. I know they were Poland, they were Lithuania, they came together, somebody kicked somebody's butt and took them over, one of the two did, I'm not sure which one. I see references to the, what looked like the, maybe the Polish side was more the ones in charge. I think I saw references to the Polish Szlachta at one point. And so I'm going to go with, at this point, that the Poles took over. But, like I said, that'll be a future episode. And I dropped that, but that's okay. That button looks pretty good. And, but they couldn't really control the area. It was more, one of the things was that these guys were Christian, right? These guys were Christian, and Byzantium had collapsed. It was now the Ottomans were there, and the Ottomans, of course, were Turks. They were Turkic. They were the one. They were part of the horde who settled down, and I say that because that's what happened all over the place. They were. I talked about that in the first episode. But in this case, one of the things about the Rus was that, we talk about them being, descended from the Norse and all that stuff. And even by what the primary chronicle said, it was like one family, maybe, who was invited and took over. It wasn't some huge, they quickly became Slavic themselves. Blood relations, continue to be recognized, apparently, according to the Norse sagas, but they did not retain much of their Norse traditions. They didn't retain the language, they didn't retain. And in the lands they took over were very diverse. And they used, the trident, the trizub, from what the conclusion that I came from was that most likely it was it was a symbol from Khazaria. And what I see in here is more of the same going on. You have the symbols that are probably coming from different areas. The Ottomans actually were the ones that it sounds like they gave the Cossacks later on the term. They labeled them Ukrainian. They were which in the language at the time to them was basically the free ones, or the free people, the ones who nobody was really in control of, even though treaties between other countries said, oh, we're in charge of these people. Oh, no, now we're in charge of these people. In reality, these people, this society they were highly valued as members of the army of whatever empire they belonged to at the time. And that was, and so despite all the problems people had with them, they were considered valuable if you could get them to fight for you. But it was a constant fight for them. I think that one of the reasons why they one of their issues was that everybody kept trying to invade them. Everybody kept trying to take them over. When the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth tried to impose serfdom on them, and they had, you have the Cossack. Yeah, so of course the Cossacks, we want the Cossacks on our side, but not all of you are Cossacks. Only those of you who belong to these military structures are actually Cossacks. And I don't know how the Cossacks themselves saw it, but one thing about Europeans is that they love lists and keeping track of who is what, and defining everything and putting everybody in these little categories. And so they had a register of Cossacks. And if you weren't on that register, you weren't a Cossack, according to the Poles. And all these people, most of these people had come in from other places in years past. They were pretty much all families of immigrants, and they were much more diverse. But one thing that bound them together was they were Eastern Orthodox. The Poles, the Poles were Catholic, Roman Catholic, which there's definite differences there in terms of how they worship and all that. But it's one flavor of Orthodoxy versus another flavor of Orthodoxy, and that was a huge dividing line between them. But one of the things that I notice about this symbol, you have the Cossack cross there, right? You also have the six-pointed star, which today we call the Star of David. I don't know if that was actually considered the this Jewish symbol back then. I'd be surprised if it wasn't, because I think that's a pretty old symbol. And then you have the crescent moons, and that kind of reminds me of the iconography of Islam. And you have the sun. And the sun I find interesting because it's very reminiscent of what you find in Mesoamerica regarding solar worship. And one of the interpretations of this can be that this is a flag that was designed to kind of reflect who actually made up the Cossacks, who made up specifically the Zaprasians, because there were other Cossacks. The Cossacks were technically part of an overarching government called the Hetmanate, and the Zaprasians, though, they were the free Cossacks. They were autonomous technically under the Hetmanate, but they often disagreed with the Hetman they acted independently. These were people that and everybody had issues with them. Everybody, but literally, it's a population of a military. This was in an era when you didn't have much in the way of professional armies. Soldiers were the people that you conscripted and took away during the seasons when farming wasn't a thing. You take your labor out of the fields, you go campaigning for a season, you bring them back home, and wow, that did not work at all. I think there may have been more than one of the metal things in there. Not sure. Or maybe I just didn't come down hard enough. Either way. Yeah, I guess no. You can see there's two of them there. I've gotten a lot better about that, but it's still sometimes an issue. But now the people who identify as Ukrainian, or at least of Ukrainian culture, that I am aware of, they specifically refer to the Zaprasian Cossacks as who they identify with. Because one of the things that struck me, Ukraine's Independence Day was earlier this week, and they had their and I watched a video that had had a translation of the song as their national anthem as it was being sung, and in the last couple of lines they refer to themselves, I think something like "we are Cossacks" or something like that, and that made me realize I don't really know anything about that. All I remember is like some Batman villain from the TV show, from the 1960s TV show, being referred to as a Cossack or something. Ended up that it was Olga, the Cossack queen, and of course I had no idea who that was at the time. And when I read a recap of the episode, which I had completely forgotten anything except that there's some over the top stereotypical villain in it. They brought in from some different culture that kids aren't really going to identify. And they used and her name was Olga, Queen of the Cossacks, and of course Olga is the name of the queen who raised Sviatoslav, and she was the one who rained hell on the people who killed her husband and then tried to get her to marry the man who killed her husband. And she was a saint. She ended up being canonized, at least in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. And that's who they were, and that was the unspoken identity of this character. And it was just, but she was queen of the Cossacks, because nobody really would have recognized Kievan Rus in 1960s American pop culture. That just wouldn't have been a thing. Somebody knew their history, and probably was actually from the comic books. I don't know the comic books very much at all. So I started reading about them and learning a little bit about them, and I was like, you know what? I have to do this episode. Because it's just too awesome of a story, I think. Especially considering that these are the people that Ukraine today identifies with, and even the name Ukraine was given to the Cossacks. Documents from several different treaties, several different international treaties and imperial decrees from people, groups outside of like Russia and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, refer to them as Ukrainians, which again looks like was something that was a name from the Turkic language, because nobody could really, you could go in and you could kill them. That happened a lot. Kept knocking their population down, kept destroying their infrastructure, and they would keep coming back. Now it was just one revolt after another, and they were always strong enough to turn around and make a new deal with somebody else, or even with the same people that they just rebelled against. And the area was such a big area, and there wasn't a lot of reason to control them. They were a buffer. Between the Ottomans and the rest of Eastern Europe. And as long as they were there, everybody else knew that they really didn't have to worry about the Ottomans. And that made them useful enough to want to keep them around, but everybody also wanted to have their name on them. They wanted to have access to them in the case of war with others. And they didn't really play well with the other militaries when that happened. They would, especially the Zaprasians, would often they might switch sides in mid-war, because hey, this guy over here is promising us freedom, and these guys aren't. And it wasn't until Catherine the Great, who came along and completely, she's like, no, this is stupid, we're not going to do this anymore, and just ended all the Cossack autonomous stuff, and had Cossacks shipped out around Russia, resettle them in different places, basically tried to do everything she could to destroy destroy their culture, destroy their identity. If you, again, look at the Ukrainian national anthem to see how well that turned out. It's kind of incredible, and the story that I see time and time again is that the people from this area, they don't care. They will just fight. You try to invade them, you try to take them over, you try to tell them what to do, and they'll fight. They'll fight you every time. Doesn't matter what the odds are. Doesn't matter what you. Now, if you don't do that, if you just let them be, if you're try to treat with them as equals, they won't have a problem with you. And that's kind of what we're seeing in Ukraine right now is Russia once again trying to establish dominance over them, trying to say, no, you are a part of us. And they're like, no. We were a long time ago. And then you all decided to be something different. And we're not going to be a part of that. And of course, what became Russia didn't have all their infrastructure destroyed. Didn't have all their cities destroyed. They were able to maintain a population base, and they were able to cut deals with the Mongols to keep it that way. And part of it, I'm sure, part of that whole freedom and all that stuff comes from more there's not a lot of people around, which over a wide area makes it really hard for there to be an authoritarian kind of system. There's no doubt about that. But others are just but I think it's more than that. I think it's more that area has always been a lot more for different reasons over the centuries, but it's always been a lot more heterogeneous, a lot more diverse than some of the other areas. And that's just, and the Cossacks, go look them up, go read about them, even just a few internet articles, hit a few websites. There's pretty much all the things that I read. I don't like that button. Pretty much said the same thing. I didn't find any really. There's definitely differences of opinions now and then based on when people got their information, but such as their origin. The original Sikh was in that big reservoir. It was on an island that was drowned to create that huge reservoir on the Dnieper River. The one that was created by that giant dam that Russia blew up. And So they've never had an opportunity to really go back and investigate it. And part of that may have been intentional on Russia's part, on the Soviet Union's part, because that they were all about trying to eliminate those kinds of symbols of the various peoples, and especially since they regarded Ukraine as a part of Russia proper. That's in a lot of ways that's what they're trying to reunite what was broken asunder. And problem is that it was never unified. Not really. It's always been very, I won't say democratic, but splintered. You had a lot of, let's just say, people at the top not agreeing on stuff. Little things like who should be the next ruler, and with the Cossacks, at least in the Zaprasian Host, they were they had basically a legislature, and they appointed the officers, and the officers met in council, and the officers had like a 1-year term, so it had to be done every year, and then the officers would decide as a group who their head guy would be. And so, theoretically, you could have a lot of turnover at the top. Obviously, I mean, it's always political, so the appearances don't often match up with reality. You're going to get the same people at the top unless they really screw up. But that's the same everywhere, right? Which kind of makes sense because, most people don't have that kind of ambition, don't want the job, don't want that kind of responsibility. And of course, once you're in power, it's all about, trading favors to remain in power. And we call that corruption. Really, it's just human nature. And, but, yeah, I thought that because of how the Ukrainian Independence Day led me down the whole trail of the Cossacks, I would bring this episode to you, and I'd share what I found, and I do a special button for them. Like with all of my history buttons, they're going to be on sale on unicornpromise.com, $1.50 each. They'll go to 50 cents of it goes to helping people in Ukraine, and once that's resolved, helping people around the world. And I got one of my issues was my color printer kind of decided to not work very well. Lots of streaks, and I couldn't get it to stop streaking. It's something with the printer heads. So I went to the FedEx store to print this out this afternoon, so I could get this to you. I kind of and I like the quality of what came out, so I may just stick with them in the future. I don't know. It's I got 3 pages of these because it's not like people are beating down my door for history buttons at this point. Oh, also, hope to be selling these at the city market and first Friday of the month, and possibly other events around the Kansas City area. Yeah. One of the things I try to pay attention to is you have things like that. No, not up to my standards. I try to make sure everything is nice and crisp. But I hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, let me know in the comments. If not, let me know in the comments. I'll take any kind of engagement I can get, good or bad. And of course, if you enjoyed this, hit like, hit subscribe. If you hated it, hit subscribe. And you can hate watch the rest of what I do. And if you didn't really like it and you're not hate watching it, well, thank you for the view. And I will catch you all hopefully next week when I will talk about more modern Ukrainian stuff. And I'm not going to remain on, Ukrainian stuff forever. I just was wanting to get at least 4 episodes out of this. I condensed down the last episode was actually what I was hoping would be 2 episodes, but I ended up doing them together in one. So this is kind of gets me back on track for doing 4. I have some other kinds of history that I'm going to cover in the weeks after that. Things that more local to Kansas City, but I think people will find interesting regardless. I like local history as well as, more global history stuff. I just like history. I like learning about the stories of where people came from and how we view those stories and kind of how they touch on things today. You have a wonderful rest of your week. Thanks for watching.